Over the last decade or so, Ethiopia has been building a massive dam at the top of the Nile. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, often abbreviated to GERD, is situated on the Blue Nile, the largest part of the two main tributaries to the Nile River. And it's caused some controversy in the region because Egypt and Sudan, the two countries downstream of Ethiopia, are concerned that the dam will mean less water for them. So in this video, we're going to be looking at why Ethiopia is building the GERD, why it's caused such consternation in Cairo and Khartoum, and whether it could spark a war. If you like our videos, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. We recently hit 350,000 subscribers, but 63% of you still haven't made the jump yet, and you could be missing out on stories from around the world. We really appreciate your support. So, the first thing to say here is that we've actually done a video on this dam before, back in May 2020, when things were normal, but a fair bit has happened since then, so we thought we'd do an update video. Anyway, before we get into the most recent developments, a bit of context. The GERD began construction in 2011, and the reservoir started filling in July 2020, a month after we did our original video. It sits on the Blue Nile, which begins in Ethiopia's Lake Tana and is responsible for 85% of the Nile's total flow, while the remaining 15% comes from the White Nile, which runs all the way from Lake Victoria in Uganda to the Sudanese capital of Khartoum, where it joins the Blue Nile to form the Nile proper. While the Nile is pretty long, it isn't that deep, and its annual output is only about 84 billion cubic meters. For context, the Congo River has an output of about 1,000 billion cubic meters, roughly 14 times that of the Nile. Nonetheless, it runs through 10 African countries, who all rely on it to some degree for fresh water. Historically, most of the Nile's water has gone to Egypt, which sort of makes sense, given that it was the most populous and most developed of the Nile countries for most of its history. In 1929, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, signed by the United Kingdom as the dominant colonial power in East Africa, guaranteed Egypt and Sudan 48 billion and 4 billion cubic meters of water respectively out of the 84 billion available. In 1959, Egypt and an independent Sudan signed a bilateral treaty which guaranteed Egypt 55.5 billion cubic meters and Sudan 18.5 billion cubic meters, and also gave them a veto over any upstream developments. As you might have noticed, this agreement didn't leave much water for the remaining 8 countries, who only had 10 billion cubic meters to share between them. It might have made some sense back then, when Egypt and Sudan were by far and away the biggest countries. But things have changed, especially in Ethiopia. Ethiopia now has a population of about 110 million people, 10 million more than Egypt, making it the second most populous African country after Nigeria, and was one of the fastest growing economies in the world during the 2010s, averaging roughly 7% GDP per capita growth annually. Despite a dynamic economy, Ethiopia is still remarkably resource poor. The average Ethiopian uses just 125 cubic meters of water and 65 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. For context, the average Egyptian uses about 570 cubic meters and 1,510 kilowatt hours, and the average American uses 1,200 cubic meters and 4,500 kilowatt hours. Obviously, the GERD will provide both water and electricity to Ethiopia, as well as a much-needed source of foreign currency if Ethiopia can sell extra energy to its neighbours, like Sudan. When complete, the dam will have a capacity of about 6,500 megawatts, more than doubling Ethiopia's current generation capacity, and supply electricity to 60% of Ethiopia's population. The reservoir, which is basically the valley around the river with a couple of big walls around it, will be about the size of Greater London, with a maximum capacity of 74 billion cubic meters, and Ethiopia began filling it back in 2020. As of August this year, Ethiopia has filled roughly 30% of the reservoir, or about 22 billion cubic meters. This is despite failing to come to any agreement with either Sudan or Egypt about either the pace at which the reservoir will be filled or how much water that will be released downstream. Egypt is particularly worried about the dam because the country relies on the Nile for more than 90% of its freshwater, the vast majority of which is used for agriculture. Research by Al Jazeera suggests that at the current rate of filling, Egypt's annual supply of freshwater will be reduced by about 22%, which would mean a 33% reduction in agriculture. This would almost definitely nonetheless mean thousands of Egyptian farmers losing their livelihoods. Sudan, Egypt and Ethiopia started negotiations on how much water the dam could use back in 2011. But the only thing the three sides agreed is that Ethiopia would take longer than 3 years to fill the reservoir. The US stepped in to mediate discussions in November 2019. But in March, Ethiopia accused the US of being undiplomatic and refused to take part in the next round of talks after the US told Ethiopia to stop construction until an agreement was reached. Furious at the lack of agreement, in 2012, Egypt threatened to bomb the dam, and in May last year, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi warned that Ethiopia's actions could cause, quote, inconceivable instability in the region after talks led by the African Union collapsed. Now, for their part, Sudan was originally more relaxed about the dam for 3 reasons. First, Sudan isn't as reliant on the Nile for freshwater as Egypt is, although it still provides about 3/4 of all its freshwater. Second, the Ethiopians promised that the dam could help with flooding, which happens in Sudan when rainfall is high. Third, and finally, Sudan, which regularly experiences power cuts for as long as 12 hours a day, had agreed to buy spare electricity from the dam. However, when Ethiopia started filling the dam at a faster rate than expected, the mood in Khartoum soured, and tensions reached a new high last year when conflict broke out in the disputed Al-Fashaga region. Bound by their mutual dislike of Ethiopia, in March of this year, Egypt and Sudan started high-level military talks, having performed joint military exercises a few months earlier. This comes on top of a series of bilateral security agreements between Egypt and a whole load of other Nile countries, including Uganda, Kenya and Burundi. It does look like an anti-Ethiopian coalition is forming, and this is particularly worrying because an agreement looks unlikely at this point. Abiy Ahmed's government weren't all that keen on negotiations in the first place, and they definitely don't have the political space to make any concessions at the moment, given the domestic troubles. On top of that, Ethiopia looks more vulnerable to invasion than at any point in recent history. As we explained in our previous video, the civil war between the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, who ruled Ethiopia for more than 20 years until 2018, and federal forces led by Ethiopia's new president Abiy Ahmed, now threatens to destabilise the country. You get the idea. While it's definitely not certain yet, there are reasons to think a war over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is more likely than ever, and the fact that the latest round of peace talks between the TPLF and Abiy's government have once again been postponed doesn't bode well. We'll be sure to update you if anything changes, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any developments in this story or around the world. And if you enjoyed this video, you might also be interested in our video over on TLDR US, where we discuss the state of Biden's relationship with Saudi Arabia. That channel's had a bit of a rough time lately, so we'd really appreciate your support over there.